This video is just going to be a brief introduction to blood and some properties that blood has. In the case of blood, blood is a tissue. By definition, tissues are groups of cells together, and blood has a liquid matrix. So therefore, blood is the only circulating connective tissue you have. If you go through my YouTube channel, you'll see that I do have several videos on tissues. And by definition, tissues are groups of cells that work together. And we take tissue and we divide them into different groups. We have what we call dense connective tissue, loose connective tissue, and we also have what we call specialized connective tissue. And one of the characteristics of connective tissue is that the cells tend to be spread out. And since tissues are groups of cells that work together, by definition, blood is a tissue. Most people just think of organs in our body, and then they just think of blood as blood, because they don't know what a tissue is. Well, blood is a tissue. It's made up of red blood cells called erythrocytes, white blood cells called leukocytes, and these things that we use in blood clotting called thrombocytes. So these cells are kind of loosely spaced. So you guys have all heard of plasma. Plasma is the liquid portion of blood. Well, that would be what we would call the matrix and the ground substance. And so that's what this is talking about here. When we talk about plasma, plasma is the liquid portion. It is almost entirely water. So we would talk about how the matrix of blood is a liquid. When you're a matrix, it's talking about the state of the ground substances. And so when you're a matrix, you're either classified as solid, gel, or liquid. And blood is the only tissue in your body that has a liquid matrix. And so the ground substance would be the stuff that makes that up. So if I were to ask you what the matrix of blood is, you tell me liquid. If I would ask you for ground substances, it would be things that you would find in the plasma. So water or things that would be dissolved in that water. Formed elements are what we call the living portion. The formed elements would be the cells that we actually find in blood. You know, if you were to take a drop of blood, 99% of what you would see would be red blood cells, which are called erythrocytes. We also have white blood cells, which make up our immune system. They're called leukocytes. And then we have thrombocytes, which make up deal with blood clotting. I do have a video here on YouTube that is about erythrocytes and red blood cells and some characteristics. And I also have one that talks about leukocytes, which are your white blood cells, and platelets. Now you guys know blood is red. Blood is always red. Okay? People talk about, well, then why when you see diagrams, are some of the blood vessels red and some of the blood vessels are blue? Well, blood is always red because of the fact our blood has rust in it. We've all seen rust. You know, rust is this browny orange color. Well, rust forms when iron gets oxidized and is left out and gets wet and deals with oxygen. Well, our blood has iron in it. You've all tasted blood. You know that blood has this metallic taste to it. Well, that's because our blood has a protein in it called hemoglobin. Hemo is the root word for blood. Globin means protein. So hemoglobin is a protein that's in our blood, and it's made from iron. And we have water in our blood, we have oxygen in our blood. That causes a chemical reaction. So the iron basically rusts, and that rust forms the red color. So blood is always red. It's different shades of red based on whether or not you have oxygen present. In our bodies, we have blood vessels that carry oxygenated blood, and we have blood vessels that carry deoxygenated blood. Well, 99% of all of our arteries carry oxygenated blood. So the blood in our arteries tends to be a bright red. 99% of all of our veins carry deoxygenated blood. So those tend to be a dark red color. Blood is always red. It's our veins that are blue. Okay. Most of the veins in our body carry deoxygenated blood, which means it has carbon dioxide in it. And when our body tissues come in contact with carbon dioxide, we do something called cyanosis, and cyan means blue. When our body tissues come in contact with high amounts of carbon dioxide, our body tissues turn blue. That's why when you're really cold, your fingers turn blue, or your toes turn blue, or your lips turn blue. Our bodies have the ability to shunt our blood vessels, which means they can stop the flow of blood to certain blood vessels. And our lips, our fingers, and toes are folds. And folds, one of my favorite things, F equals SA, folds equals surface area. The more folds you have, the more heat can be released. You can think of it that way. So when it's really cold, our body kind of closes the blood vessels that go to our fingers, our toes, and our lips, so we don't lose a lot of heat. So carbon dioxide gets trapped in that tissue. So when carbon dioxide gets trapped in the tissue, that's why it turns blue. Well, most of our veins carry carbon dioxide. So our veins have turned blue. It's the veins that are blue, not the blood that's inside of them. Okay. And again, I talked about how blood does have this metallic taste to it because that's in it. There's a few other facts about blood. Blood has volume. So most people have about 12 pints of blood. So when you go and donate blood, sometimes they'll take like a half a pint or a pint. So they're not really taking a lot, but a lot, just a little bit of blood can still look like a lot. But on average, again, this is an average. Children obviously have less than adults. And a larger size adult will not necessarily have more blood than a smaller size adult. Just on average, we have about 12 pints of blood. And all of our blood is shoved into these little itsy bitsy blood vessels. If you think back to diffusion, nothing likes to be crowded. So everything is trying to run away from each other in order to spread out. And this is one of the factors that actually helps blood move through our blood vessels. But when blood is spilled, a lot of blood, it makes it look like there's a lot of blood coming out. Because just like, when you spill your water, it kind of goes all over. Well, blood is like being forced through these little tunnels, and all of a sudden there's a door, and it can go running out that door and just like, oh, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free. And so when blood is spilled, it goes from a small area with high pressure to a larger area. So that's diffusion, going from an area of high pressure to low pressure. And so it's able to spread out. So a little bit of blood can look like a lot. You've all seen these real dramatic movie scenes or TV scenes where there's a body lying on the ground and it looks like the blood is just flowing out from underneath it. Well, in all honesty, that doesn't really happen most of the time in nature, because when blood begins to cool, it thickens and so it stops flowing. But in order for like those dramatic scenes to happen, that person would have to have like a really deep cut and have cut some major blood vessels. But when you become a parent, your child will come in screaming, I've cut myself and there's blood all over the place. But when you clean it, there's just like this little itsy bitsy cut. That's just like the idea of you being jammed into this little itsy bitsy small car. And as soon as that door opens, you'll all just come out and like spread out, just get away from me, don't touch me. Okay? And that's just, again, going from an area that's crowded to an area that's not crowded. Now, if I were to ask you what the pH of blood is, a lot of you would have told me that blood is neutral. And remember, when we talk about things being acids, they have a pH from 0 to 6.999. Anything that's a base has a pH of 7.01 all the way up to 14. Well, things that are bases are also what we call alkaline. And a lot of people don't realize that our blood is actually a base. Our blood's pH is about 7.4. And the reason for that, carbon dioxide is acidic. That's why we breathe out. Yes, our cells need oxygen. They need oxygen to make ATP, but our cells can actually make ATP without oxygen. They don't do a very good job of it, but they can. One of the major reasons that we breathe is to actually get rid of carbon dioxide. Because when carbon dioxide is mixed with water, you get what's called carboxyl acid. So our brain actually tells us to breathe out. We need to get rid of that acid before it can destroy our cells. Well, if carbon dioxide is an acid, you guys know when you mix acids and bases together, it neutralizes it. So if our blood was neutral, carbon dioxide would take that pH and make it acidic, which would destroy a lot of cells and denature proteins. So our blood needs to be a base in order to mix with the acidic carboxyl acid in order to neutralize it as it passes through our body. Now, there are times when our blood can become too acidic. This is what's called acidosis. And at the same time, there are times where our blood can become too basic. This is why, for example, we can't drink bleach or things like that. Not only will it totally destroy our digestive system, but it can cause situations in our bloodstream. Because remember, the proteins in our blood, proteins are divas. They have to have certain pHs. And so the proteins that make up our blood cells work best at 7.4. So if our blood becomes too acidic or our blood becomes too basic, it can cause those proteins to denature. I remember when proteins denature, that means they change shape. And again, SDF, structure determines function. If a protein changes shape, it's going to have a different job. It's just like taking a piece of paper. If you ball it up, that piece of paper can act as a ball. And you can play with it, you can throw it back and forth. But if you take that piece of paper and fold it, it's now a fan. So it's the same piece of paper, but just by changing the shape, you give it two different jobs. Well, this can happen. This is what we talk about when we say a protein denatures, it changes shape. So if it changes shape, it's going to have a different job. And if it doesn't, if it's in our blood cells, then our blood cells aren't going to work like they're supposed to. Now, when we talk about functions of blood, distribution, red blood cells, which I have another video on YouTube, they're erythrocytes, are what we call biconcave discs. They basically look like a tire, but they don't have a hole going through it. I call them a boat or a basket. It's their job to carry things around. So if you think of red blood cells as boats, one of the functions of blood is to distribute things. And you know, when you distribute things, you pass them out. So distribution, it helps deliver oxygen to the body parts. It carries waste products like carbon dioxide, urea, and it also transports nutrients and hormones. With regulation, it helps maintain proper body temperature. Your blood is hot, and blood gets carried to all different parts of your body, so it helps carry heat. It also helps maintain your pH and proper fluid system. And in the case of protection, this is another video that I have, or several videos. Your white blood cells, which are called leukocytes, are what I call your police department. And it's their job to help fight off bad guys. Just like the police go out and arrest bad guys, your white blood cells help arrest or stop the spread of what are called pathogens, things like viruses, bacteria. And so they are part of your immune system. Platelets are what are called thrombocytes, are also on the same video with white blood cells. And these play a huge role in blood clotting. So the only time you should form a blood clot is when you cut a blood vessel, and that leads to the risk of infection. So we want to stick a cork in it. We want to stick a plug in it. And so this also goes along with your immune system. And you can find that on the video that I have. Now, like I mentioned before, blood is a tissue. And by definition, tissues are groups of cells that work together. And it is a connective tissue, which means there is space between the cells. But that space is not empty. That space is not hollow. It is filled with substances. And that substance is your plasma, is the liquid portion of your blood. About 55% of your blood is made from plasma. And just as a side note here, when in my classes, I use the anatomy coloring book by Caput. I personally have the 4th edition. It has skulls on the front. And so if you have the anatomy coloring book, I want to say it's like page 100, you can see a breakdown of blood and the different parts of blood that goes along with this slide. So plasma is what's called the matrix. The matrix, however, is the state. Is it a liquid? Is it a gel? Is it a solid? And so blood has what we call a liquid matrix. And whatever makes up that matrix is called ground substances. So in the case of blood, ground substance would be something like water and anything that's dissolved in that water. We also have what are called the formed elements. And again, these are the cells that are actually in the tissue. So we have your erythrocytes, which are your red blood cells, and I do have a video about just them. And then white blood cells, which are your leukocytes, they're your police department, and your thrombocytes, which are your platelets, and I have another video just about those. But the making of blood is called hematopoiesis. Anytime you see the root word hema, hema is going to mean blood. Then you have the root word poiesis, just like a poet. This is where that term comes from. Poiesis means to create. So hematopoiesis is the making of blood cells. And this occurs in our bone marrow. In the case of our bone marrow, we have red bone marrow and we have yellow bone marrow. And red bone marrow is red because this is where blood gets made. Yellow bone marrow is yellow because it contains fat. And the fat is actually what the red bone marrow feeds off of in order to get their energy. But in the case of our red bone marrow, we have cells called hematopoietic cells. They're also called hemocytoblast. Remember again, anytime you see hema, hema means that it's blood, okay? And poet means to create. So hematopoietic cells, these are cells that create blood. At the same time, you have hemocytoblast. Anytime you see the root word blast, it's going to make something. Cyte, as you know, means cells, and hema means blood. So hematocytoblast are cells that make blood cells. So hematopoietic cells and hemocytoblasts are the same thing. And these are what I call mama cells that are inside of our red bone marrow. And their only job is to go through mitosis and make blood cells. Well, through this process, all blood cells are made the same way. However, I'm going to focus on red blood cells, and somehow the bone marrow needs to know, hey, I need you to make some red blood cells. And this is all done by hormones. Hormones are going to tell your red bone marrow what they need to make. And they do so, different organs are watching what's going on. And in the case of your kidneys, blood constantly goes to your kidneys. And so your kidneys have the ability to track how thick or how thin your blood is. When we don't have a lot of red blood cells, your blood becomes really watery. And that's a clue to your kidneys, hey, you need to make more red blood cells. So your kidneys will talk to your bone marrow through a hormone called erythropoietin. Urethro means red, and poietin means to make. So this is the hormone, it's made by the kidneys, but this is the hormone that tells your red bone marrow, hey, you need to make your red blood cells. So this is just a brief intro, just some background information about blood and how blood gets made. Okay. Like I said, check my YouTube channel, Christina Dotson at Leesville. You'll be able to find a video on erythrocytes, which are red blood cells, and their characteristics, and what a normal red blood cell is, what some abnormal red blood cells are. I also have a video on white blood cells, which are leukocytes, your police department, and the 5 kinds of white blood cells we have, and thrombocytes and how our body forms a blood clot.